как жамал, бедный молодцы на майда шокум дед урунуп шарпылдап, кушкун деди
From the end of the Timurid Renaissance and until the 18th century, this region remained mostly invisible to the world. It was rediscovered in the 19th century, but soon enough it fell to Russia, and that remained an accepted fact really until about 3 years ago. Though, of course, locals will point out to a slightly earlier moment. In the last 3 years, though, more things have changed in Central Asia than in the previous 30. And in some aspects, more things have changed in the last 3 years than in the previous 100. At this particular juncture in the history of Central Asia, predictions are the most difficult to make because the new trends are still fragile. In some ways, the situation may resemble the 1920s when the old Khanate order was being dismantled and many hoped something better would emerge. But then it got worse, as it is usually the case with places influenced by Russia. Currently, the Russian-led order is slowly being dismantled, just as chaotically as 100 years ago. So what's in the bag for Central Asia in the future? While we can't know for sure, it is most definitely interesting to observe the transformations and try to infer from them. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the 15th featured installment of the Central Asia featured series. So, in this series so far, we looked through the brief history of every country in the region with a more profound focus on Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan because they're larger. Then we looked through the present politics, geopolitics, and economics. We still need to go through the demographics, which will be a subject in a wider series about demographics later this year, and through the social life, which will make the object of the next episode. But until then, let's take a moment to zoom out a little bit and really just look in awe about the changes that are occurring at a remarkable pace in this region. So, when I hopped onto the plane towards Kazakhstan in late July 2022, I had one idea about how this series will look like. Less than 20% of that idea survived by the end of the trip. The way this series would flow was decided about a month after returning to Europe, and while I stayed true to the plan, some modifications became necessary because the initial ideas from the end of 2022 became obsolete by the time episode 10 was finalized. To wit, you are now looking at the first pictures I took in Kazakhstan in late July of 2022. At that time, Mikhail Gorbachev was still alive. I read about his death in the local Kazakh newspaper. In the meantime, that newspaper doesn't exist anymore because Russian language media has taken multiple blows in the last 2 years. At the time these images were taken, Russian was the only language spoken on the streets of Almaty. I had to either turn on the TV or go to the villages to hear the Kazakh language. As of May 2024, that has changed a lot. The signs were already there even as I was strolling through the excruciating heat of Kazakh summer almost 2 years ago. In January 2022, the Kazakh Foreign Ministry had started banning loud Russian media personalities who had made a habit of insulting Kazakhstan and Central Asia as a matter of course. The reason wasn't a big deal, thought many at the time. Kazakhstan had just changed the names of some train stations and some loudmouth in Russia whined about it. That wasn't new. But what was new was the willingness of the local elites to say enough is enough. Or, in the words of Ibex Madiarov, spokesman for the foreign ministry, quote, "If you don't like someone, then you don't let that person into your home, and that's how we're going to proceed," unquote. Then followed the swift deportation of the Russian military and the political changes after the Bloody January. For those new to the channel, all of this was covered in episode 5. But since I left the region, the pace of changes accelerated to levels I had in mind then, see the tone of the first episodes, but not at this speed. In August 2022, the idea that the pro-Russian president of Kyrgyzstan would insist on a bill mandating proficiency in the Kyrgyz language for state officials was a pipe dream. Even the suggestion of somewhat addressing the language space was controversial, and I learned that by the strange looks I got when I was gathering the data in Bishkek. 1 year later, in July 2023, nominally pro-Russian President Japarov found himself in a spat with Sergei Lavrov, the eternal Foreign Affairs Minister of Russia, precisely on this topic. Mr. Japarov weaseled out of the controversy by saying that it's a misunderstanding. Quote, "As we have seen, state employees and members of parliament speak half in Russian and half in Kyrgyz. No one speaks fluent Russian or fluent Kyrgyz. The two languages are jumbled up. Therefore, we need to master both languages equally," unquote. Well, that's cute for diplomatic dinners, but the bill remained, and now, another 10 months later, state officials are demoted and sometimes fired for not knowing the state language under this law. This would have been straight up unimaginable when I was taping these images on the streets of Bishkek. But not all of the things that seemed unimaginable in 2022 and are now the new reality are positive. You see, the changes here aren't coordinated, even though both the West and Moscow would want you to believe they are. The changes here are random, chaotic. As a general trend, they do appear to head towards some form of de-Russification, or if you want, decolonization, although that's not a term I would use, but local activists of liberal persuasion sometimes use it. But that doesn't tell us much. It's all in a flow. So, for instance, Kyrgyzstan is today more autocratic than in 2022, though, to be fair, still more democratic than in 2020 and certainly far better than in 2009, as explained in the episodes about this place. While the regime low-key praises moves away from Russification, the flagship media organization that dared to risk money into opening a Kyrgyz-only outlet is also the main target of the regime for harassment and repression. The year 2024 has seen more journalists and dissident figures jailed or otherwise harassed by the state in Kyrgyzstan than any other year since independence, with the exception of 2009 and 2010. In a way, there is some sort of a political convergence. While Kyrgyzstan experiences some democratic backsliding, neighboring Tajikistan and Kazakhstan are more liberal today than 5 years ago. Kazakhstan, in fact, significantly so. Old projects of more independent media and transition away from the Cyrillic alphabet have caught a new life in 4 of the 5 post-Soviet Central Asian countries. As always, Turkmenistan being the negative exception, the only country in the region to have gotten worse on almost all metrics since 2019. These turbulences are, of course, displeasing many, but we also need not forget that these aren't just young countries politically, with all of them having gained or regained independence just 33 years ago, but young in terms of demographics. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the largest of them, have had rising birth rates and total fertility rates, with Kazakhstan being the most spectacular, rising from a total fertility rate of 1.8 to over 3.2 in just 15 years. All while liberalizing and without significant resurgence of religion, thus definitely putting a dent into nearly all of the common European and North American cringe hypotheses about what drives fertility. Now, I'll get back to this topic some other time later this year, but for the purposes of this talk, these facts show us that these are very young nations, which means the populace is more rowdy, more open to experimentation, and more likely to support bold reforms. The median age in Kazakhstan is 29 years old, 27 in Uzbekistan. The leadership, by comparison, is geriatric. So, if they want to stay in power, they'll have to assume the role of temporization, which they are doing. Maintaining a balance between the speed of reform expected and doing it without destabilizing their countries requires wisdom. So far, it's been working out pretty well, literally good enough for government work. Now, the reason I mentioned that these are demographically young nations is also because, comparatively speaking, Russia is very old, and China is increasingly old too, which means the national mood here can be, at least in theory, both positive and realistic about forging a different path for the region in a way that was unimaginable in 1994. In Kazakhstan, this young and very numerous cohort even has a name, the Nazarbayev generation. In Uzbekistan, they don't have a name yet because, well, research of this is only starting now. The story of the nation is still being written, which is why I want to get back here as soon as possible. Demographics partially explain the enthusiasm and also explains the other aspect where the transformations are even more spectacular and even more consistently positive than politics. I'm talking, of course, about economics. Slowly but surely, all countries of the region, again except Turkmenistan, are graduating from the status of grant and aid-receiving poor countries to the status of appropriate destinations for profit-seeking investment. This is also a new phenomenon for the region, certainly the first time almost everyone alive today sees it. And being able to attract new jobs here is amazingly important, and a lot of that is the merit of the population, certainly in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, whose economies have already been quite well liberalized, relatively speaking, of course. In the first 5 months of 2024, Central Asia in general and Tajikistan and Kazakhstan in particular have seen more Western and Chinese inquiries for investment than in the previous decade. Sure, the more cynical among us could say that this is basically a scramble for Central Asia and take advantage of the diminishing Russian influence in the region as well as the diminishing economic power of Russia. And there is certainly some of that at play as well, but remember, this started 5 or 6 years ago, when Russia's influence was higher and Russia had no significant economic problems. Meanwhile, most of the economic changes are incredibly popular, at least for the time being. The Carville adage, "it's the economy, stupid," does seem to apply. Even the fiercely independent-minded Kyrgyz are willing to tolerate some democratic backsliding if they get more access to prosperity and economic freedom. Some scholars are puzzled by this, especially the liberal-minded ones in Bishkek, who are hoping that the prosperity will bring their social ideas more popularity as well, but as it turns out, that ain't happening. But one shouldn't be puzzled at all. Economic concerns are number 1, 2, and 3 in the West as well, including in countries with hundreds of years of democratic tradition. As much as ideologues don't like to hear this, the fact remains that as a statistical norm, more people are willing to ignore concerns about democracy if they're getting more prosperous. And looking from this angle, the relative political convergence in Central Asia, with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan becoming slightly more democratic and Kyrgyzstan slightly less so, makes perfect sense. In all 4 of them, democratic concerns appeared in the last 5 years exclusively in connection to economics. In Uzbekistan, the regime no longer repressed protests in the hope of reaching a deal. We give you economic freedom and some freedom of assembly, and in return, you legitimize us to stay in power for at least another 14 years. The result is an acceptable trade-off by regional standards. The country is more open economically than it has ever been in the last century. The standard of living is growing at frightening speeds, and for the first time ever, there's real-life protections and guarantees to private property rights. A not-so-subtle nod to the fact that without clear property rights, there is no prosperity. Also, a not-so-subtle repudiation of the Soviet and Karimov legacy. And then there's the diplomacy part. Just a few weeks ago, all 5 capitals were busy with Western diplomats. None of them arrived alone or empty-handed. Several billions of dollars worth of trade agreements were doled out, and several billions more in investments and aid, the latter mostly to Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. The Russian press calls these increased visits by unfriendly nations. While to the West, Russia still projects an image of strength, even though fewer and fewer people believe it, internally there is a lot of concern. You won't hear the Kremlin complaining about Kazakhstan selling Soviet weaponry to the US, but they're concerned. Now hold on, what? Kazakhstan selling Soviet weaponry to the United States? Well, yes, by the boatload in fact. 81 fighter jets just last month, officially decommissioned and sold as spare parts, but who knows? Even if decommissioned, this equipment is now surely already in Ukraine, either being used at face value or used for spare parts and decoys. That's also a change that seemed impossible when I was videotaping these images and the official position was one of tepid neutrality. This change also didn't happen in a vacuum. While we tend to criticize Western foreign policy, sometimes rightfully so, it should be said that in the case of Central Asia, the foreign policy of the West was much better than expected. Now, admittedly, some of us had legit no expectations, but still. So, what's next? Well, as said in episode 5, made over a year ago, the pace of change is so rapid that even by the time this video gets published, some of this may become outdated. By historical standards, this happened only once in Central Asia between 1916 and 1923. Even the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't bring so many changes so fast and so simultaneously throughout the whole region. Well, again, except Turkmenistan, but you get the point. So it could very well be the case that in the next 3 years we'll see the second exit from CSTO after Armenia, and it will come from this region. It's also pretty clear that there is a new consensus on the language issue. I don't want to say de-Russification is irreversible, but I will say that by 2030 the language space around here will be very different. Heck, in 2022 I was routinely approached by youngsters as soon as they figured it out that I wasn't Russian. They didn't want anything other than to practice their English with me.
Sorry, you English?
Yes. Well, I'm not English, but I do speak English.
You want? No. I want to discuss your in English for my speaking.
Ah, for your improvement.
May I?
Well, please do. I'm listening.
This happened once or twice in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but a lot more often in Uzbekistan. That's not by accident. I saw more USA t-shirts in 2 weeks in Uzbekistan than in a similar period in Germany. And even among Russian-speaking youngsters in the nightclubs, the motifs in the discussions were either East Asian, that would be Korean and Japanese, or Western. Not so much Russian. Not anymore. And that has accelerated in the meantime. It will indeed be a textbook case of politics being downstream from culture. Sure, it will take a while, but the Russian space simply lost the battle for the souls of the next generation. And since the next generation is far more numerous than the previous ones, it is only a matter of time before this becomes reflected in the politics even more so than it is the case today. On economics, if this region can stay away from war, they'll be fine. Especially if they all manage to fix their border disputes. The progress is remarkable, but there's still time for things to go wrong. If this is avoided, then quite literally the sky is the limit. They already have a low-tax environment, again, except Turkmenistan, but I can't repeat that all the time. If they can manage contract law, these countries have all the ingredients to be wealthy. Okay, maybe not economic superpowers, although together they could even be that, though it's harder, but definitely high-income countries desirable to live in them. They have healthy demographics, low crime, a lot of natural resources, increasingly better access to investors, capital and global markets, better than ever access to know-how, ironically thanks to Russia, which convinced its highly qualified people to flee to these countries, and perhaps most important, they have a populace that is more open to these things than in the decades prior. So the main enemy to the prosperity of the countries of Central Asia will be internal. I say the main enemy because yes, there's also China nearby, which is a risk that will have to be managed with wisdom forever and ever till the end of times. China isn't leaving, but the way Central Asia functions in relation to China is not an immutable characteristic, but a political choice. Speaking of political choices, one main risk will be internal politics, especially in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, countries without much experience in managing dissidence, change, and a more pluralistic society. By the same token, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have built a relatively robust experience in how to manage this. Not an excellent one, but certainly better than nothing. Of course, the trouble remains Turkmenistan. Whether the Berdimuhamedov dynasty survives into post-modernity is anyone's guess, but if it doesn't, there be dragons. On a long enough timeline, it would be better if the Turkmen regime goes down, but right after that happens, there's no way to tell how things will go. It could go pretty well, like it did in Kyrgyzstan, but it could also go really badly, like in Tajikistan with a civil war, or like in Uzbekistan with the Karimov-style dictatorship, which, although an improvement over the status quo, it would still be bad for the wealth and prosperity of the Turkmen people. In terms of geopolitical risks, other than China, there's also Turkey. The current political class in Ankara is highly interested in Central Asia, both for cultural affinity reasons, but also, of course, for financial reasons. The way Ankara will behave here will make a difference. If I were to bet, I would bet it will be a mostly positive difference, but with dark or weird episodes here and there. So, kind of like the Ottoman Empire. It also does depend which kind of administration will follow after the end of the Erdogan administration. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan would prefer a more Ottomanist approach, while Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan would definitely be suited better to work with a Kemalist approach, which means the region can manage its relationship with Turkey quite well if it chooses to use its strength depending on the political context in Ankara. I'm not saying this is ideal, but I am saying that geopolitics is real, and until these countries become wealthy enough, the leadership here will have to take these things into account. Ultimately, nobody can know for sure, and there are aspects that are beyond the control of Central Asia that could negatively impact the region. What if the CCP collapses? The pressure on Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan could be enormous. Just think of the outflow of Uyghur refugees. There are already quite a few of them in the region, especially in Bishkek, but what if the flow grows tenfold? It's entirely possible, and it wouldn't be fun. Similarly, what if things go really wrong in Russia? The current geopolitical entity called Russia is highly unlikely to initiate aggression in the region, mostly because it simply can't. But a disintegration of Russia may bring flare-ups of violence in areas not thought of as hotspots before, such as Petropavlovsk in the West Siberian plain. The city is in Kazakhstan but 60% Russian, and there have been separatist attempts before, though easily managed by the authorities. Heck, even more moderate scenarios in Russia can spell trouble in the region, like the current colonization of Russia by China. What if that continues at higher rates than now and border regions with Kazakhstan become de facto Chinese? That may not be fun either. Such security concerns should feature on the security councils of these countries and should be on the mind of any think tank that takes this region seriously. It's better to be prepared than to be surprised, especially since the stakes are much higher today than in 1992. And I'm not talking about the power or the economical stakes, but in sheer numbers of people. This region is home to 80 million people, on average younger than Russia and increasingly wealthier than a lot of Russians. Uzbekistan was home to 28 million people in 2010. As of 2024, that number is close to 36 million people. And it will be higher than 40 million people by the end of this decade, for sure. Managing this is going to be a challenge in and of itself, and a lot of things can go wrong. But yeah, overall, things are looking up, and there are grounds for moderate optimism. Basically, don't mess this one up, guys. It's a once-in-a-century opportunity, maybe even more than once in a century. Almost all relevant stars are aligned in favor of Central Asia. That's no guarantee of success, but it's a good start. So, if you like these things, please consider supporting the next series in the works. After this, we'll cover Cambodia and Laos, stories even more successful in some ways, and we'll want to cover Colombia and Ecuador, stories of moderate success with very visible present-day challenges. But that is not free, so please consider supporting the Colombia-Ecuador series. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.